Okay, first of all, on behalf of the three of us, I would like to thank the club for the scholarships. Very beneficial. While some of us had done some threading before, we picked up some techniques and some nuances that just took our skill level up another big notch. So we're going to cover that today. We're going to cheat a little. 30% of what we covered today is what we learned in class. There's another 60-some% that we're going to tell you are options for threading that you can also consider. And the reason we're doing this is there's a lot of things you can do and ways to thread. And when we get done with this project, you'll be able to walk around in your shop, pick up a piece of wood, take a look at it and say, how do I thread thee? Let me count the ways. So I apologize to Elizabeth Barrett Browning for that. But let's get started and talk about all the various ways that you can do threading. Now, I can't see the screen. Where are we? You want to put the first thing up?
Real quick, how many people have done threading on wood? Oh, like a wood box or something like that? Okay.
Not many, huh?
Not many. I'm surprised.
Oh.
So we're not talking to the...
No, virgin territory. That's a funny thing.
We happen to have an example of that.
You're a great straight man because this is an option to get threads and wood. Where this becomes extremely useful is when you make an urn. Make the urn itself, buy the fittings at Home Depot or wherever, and then you have very good threads, fill it, put a sealer on it, it's sealed, you're now legal, and away to go. Here's the first way you can do threading. It's simple. Those of us that have been in the metal business, we know exactly how it's done. It can work for wood. The most successful example is doing things like this. Get a piece of Trex, but this is Trex. It threads like a dream, and it's wonderful, particularly if you're going to make vacuum chucks and things like that. And you make it by using this tap to thread it. Very easy to do and a great way to get started and use that type of a tap and die to do threads. Now, I'll tell you about it. You can tap wood fairly easily with this type of a device. And by the way, you can get started if you want to go to Home Depot, or to Harbor Freight. For $12, you can get a tap and die set if you don't have one. If you want to get a really nice one, you go to Amazon, and for $350, it's yours. My recommendation, don't do it. The most successful tap for wood turners is the one going around making for that chuck. That one is very useful. I have used taps like that in wood before, but there are easier ways to do it. So the next option, our buddies at Beal, they make a tapping set. What a surprise. It's different though. On a Beal, you buy from them a tooth that goes into your router. And then there's this cute little board that you see there, and there's a hole in it. And then what happens is you feed a rod into that hole, hand turn it, and it's got a guide so that when you get done, you end up with a threaded rod. And then they sell you a tap that will do the female portion. And now you have a bolt and nut that's wood. So you can see the various steps and phases. It's not too bad. You can get into that for $75 to $150 to get those. Keep going down, or up as the case may be. Now let's get into things that are a little more complicated. And we do have somebody in the club that has one of these. You start with this cute little gizmo. Now you've got to add a few things to it, like your own chuck. You've got to buy a special cutter. You've got to buy a drawbar that goes through your power head so that you can take a hold of the cutter and pull it in. And then the cutter will set up, turn your lathe on. You have to line it up. Lathe goes, cutter turns. And with this, you screw it in and you can thread whatever is being held on by your chuck. A little complicated, got to do some lining up. You got to decide you really want to do this. Because this is about $390. I'm sorry, $319. The other thing is in the April issue of AAW in 2013, Mike wrote an article about how you too can make your very own setup to do the same thing. And originally I thought, I think I want to do that. Well, then I started going through and started pricing out the various pieces required in order to do this. You got to buy this. You got to buy the cutter. You got to use your chuck. You get a 3/4 10 threaded rod. You got to get an adapter to hold your chuck, and you start mounting this all. By the time I got to $180, I decided, no, I don't think it's worth it for me to do that. So I didn't. This is available if you're so inclined. As I'm going through this presentation, I gleaned out all the websites that I'm referring to. They're coming around on the paper. The easiest thing will be, though, wait until it gets posted on the web page, because then it's a hot link. You can just click on it and it'll take you right to where it is, and you don't have to worry about copying all that stuff in to know what's going on. We're down through those two, simple, complicated. Now we get into tools as they come from Craft Supply. Let's see where we are. There you go. In the Craft Supply, this set's available for $175. Don't get excited yet. They show you these two tools. The polite way to say it is when you buy these tools, they're not very usable. Come see us. There's some changes you need to make them very effective. And we'll get into that. You also have the ability in doing threading, is that some people swear by this tool. If you're a production turner, this tool is usually carried on a little loop and hangs down like this. So when it comes time to do threading, you pick it up and it goes. And it saves you having to do a change to move your tool rest around to support it, to then use the internal threading tool. Now, I don't know about you, I'm not on the clock anymore. I can afford to move the tool rest around. If anybody is interested in a tool like this, come see me. I can make you a heck of a deal. But to me, it's a little more cumbersome to use this to develop that particular technique.
If any of you have watched the Alan Beatty DVD on doing threading,
yes,
he uses one of those exclusively. But changes have been made so that you don't have to do that. There's other tools that you can use.
Yeah, and there's different kinds of tools. This is now the hot setup. This is a Mahoney tool or a Carter tool. That I haven't used, but it feels nice in your hands. Now, if you want to buy threading tools, there's three options. Craft Supply, you can get a set for $175. Amazon, you don't get the little threading gauge, which is the, I'm moving my screen here and it doesn't help you a bit. That little device up there. I've never used it. I understand where it might be useful, but it's not worth it. Or if you really want to go someplace, go to Hartville Hardware, $80. You can buy a set of threading tools. Now we're getting down into the range it's practical. I talked about the tools are kind of useful. We got the next, go up to the next picture, please. There we go. When you get the tools originally, this tool comes in the back is a little more square. You want to round this off. Talk about that a little later, why that's necessary. And you want to sharpen, and the way you sharpen is you grind just this top surface, just a little bit, but not too much. The other tool that you get, you want to put a relief here. And that becomes important when you do threads in the outside, and we'll talk about that. And again, grind a little bit here. It's kind of interesting because to sharpen the tool as you go on, you just take a little more off the top. Well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is it works pretty good, and as it gets thinner, it works better. And the best cut you're going to make with this tool is the one just before you throw it away. Rick talked about Alan Beatty, and on the paper I handed out, you've got some things there. Batty will explain to you how to do the threading. Takes him an hour. Captain Eddie Castleton does the same thing in 34 minutes. The other one that's good is a guy by the name of Fred Holder. There's a link there. And that's a good video too, as well, telling you how to do the thing. They talk about in April of 2003, there was an article about how you can make your own threading equipment. And basically what they taught you how to do is to take remember the tap and the die we had originally, take a tap and use it as a thread cutter. Theoretically, that's possible. I've done it. I don't recommend it. It doesn't really work out that well. Yeah, it does, but it's a totally different feel and rhythm in order to get that thing to work and to work correctly. When you talk about threading, we talk about TPI, which is threads per inch. Why do you have different ones? You got 16s, you got 20s. The fewer threads per inch, the easier it is to put threads, particularly in soft wood. Now, there's good news and there's bad news. You can put the threads in, but how durable are they? Because if you do it in soft wood, about the first or second time you thread them together, they're going to pop and come off. So you want something that's a good thread. If you go to like a 20 threads per inch, that's something you use on a hardwood, whether it's ebony, box elder, or whatever. Now, there are woods that are good to thread, and then there are other woods. This is a box that has samples of various woods that have had threads that have been tried to be put into the wood, and you can see what the results are. You get tear out. Things don't quite match so well. They break after you've threaded them. A lot of issues. You got to be careful about which wood to use. Yes. The question was, if I tried to use thin CA to toughen up the threads in soft woods. Yes. And that works. It works if you can get the threads put in first and then kind of seal them with the CA. That helps the durability of them by far. The trick is in the softer woods, getting it not to tear out before you get the thread put in it. And of course, if you're going to do that and put CA on, you've got to be able to coat it evenly. Make sure you adjust for that size to add the CA later. And sometimes when you do that and you coat, particularly an internal thread with a CA, now you get a bump right down here at the bottom where the CA may collect and run, and you may have to go back and retrace that out. So that is a way to save, let's say, to improve threads in softwood. The comment was, don't use accelerator and CA if you're trying to work on the threads, because it will cause the CA to foam up. And that does make it a little rough and bumpy.
Another thing that you're going to find out is how many of you, when you pick up something like this, just go like that? Well, the threads that you're going to find in the softer woods and even in some of the hardwoods will come right off. If you do that, you'll twist them off. Or if you turn it past where it's supposed to stop, you'll strip the threads out just like you will when you're turning. So when you're picking up a box in the future, take and reverse it. That way, if it's threaded, it will come off without stripping out the threads.
Yeah.
And we saw a couple of that happen when we were up at Craft Supply.
What do you mean that happened?
When you pick up something like this, if you turn it, well, it's got threads on it, apart it comes. If you just were to take and pull it, you'd strip the threads off it. So be careful when you're picking up pieces of work.
This is the threaded bowl that I did there. There's another technique, and this was a very nice piece of wood. There is a trick that when it gets done, the grain matches. And that's done by cutting the threads first, see how you line up. The easiest thing to do is to take a little bit off of, for me, the male threads to let the top come down. And it's a matter of just adjusting a little bit, comes down this much, rotates that much, and you got to catch it on the way by. If you don't, go all the way around again to get it to line up. And if you screw this one down very hard, it will come off being in alignment. Probably, let me make sure I don't get a, oh yeah. Let's talk about the woods that are good for threading. You want something that's got a high specific gravity. The denser the wood in general, the better it is to thread. So what does that mean? Oh, and you also want very small, fine grain woods. Ebony is wonderful. Lignum vitae is very nice. It's got a specific gravity of 1.25. That means it'll sink. African blackwood, cocobola, mountain mahogany, ironwood, the Trex material, it's got about a 0.96 specific gravity. Persimmon will thread nice, 0.9. Boxwood is very nice. Osage orange, you're down about 0.83, but that still threads very nice. Apple, a lot of the fruit woods, you can get those to thread. Don't do pine. Pine's got a specific gravity between 0.34 and 0.5, and it tears up more than it threads. I don't have any experience with beech, but I think it would be too soft. When you thread, you also want to do face grain, not ingrained. Ingrain, you know, you've got a nice little piece. You think, well, this would be pretty cool. But think about what the fibers do. The fibers go this way. You cut this way. So what you've got is you've got a little tiny piece like that trying to hold that thread on. The first time you thread it on, it goes bye-bye. Cute little deal. $105 plus $10. If I was in the market to buy again, this is probably what I would buy. But I own these. I know how to use them. They're working well for me. Now, once you get into using these tools, Sam Angelo has a very nice video about how to do this sort of thing. And he inserts a different piece of wood into the original project, and then that's what holds his threads. That is probably my second favorite way to put threads into a vessel when the primary wood isn't suitable for threading. Because you can glue it in, however, and then go put the threads. Now you've got something that's threadable, will hold, and you're in good shape. Ebony makes excellent inserts for threads. Pricey, but we found a contact several years ago. Some of us ordered a whole box of ebony. I thought, that's cool. I'll call that guy up. Phone didn't work. He moved. So here's his new address and new phone number. And I said, do you still sell pieces of ebony if we want to buy some? And the answer is yes. Now the deal is it's a 10-pound minimum. You get African Gabon ebony. You'll get it for $9 a pound. Now the going rate on that type of a wood right now is more like $20 a pound. So it's a good buy, even though you're going to say goodbye to a lot of money. But that's a way, if you want to get some ebony, you can get in touch with him and he'll send you some stuff. Gary's point was that when you put an order in with him, you need to specify what size pieces you want. And he did reiterate that if you let him know when you order that you're looking for a little larger pieces, he'll try to accommodate it. But he said if he can't, maybe you want to take a look at buying some of the regular ebony boards, and then you're back, up to the $20 a pound range. But if you tell him what you're looking for, he'll work with you as best he can to get what you're looking for. Now we're getting into my favorite way to get threads. Resin. Epoxy threads like a dream. This is a little lidded box. I did this back when we were meeting at Ed Jones' shop every Tuesday. So it's been a while. And I did the box. I was very pleased with it. And then Corel was sitting next to me and she says, "Can I have that? I'd like to embellish it." Now I'm even more thrilled with it. So I did the easy part. She did the hard part. But this is epoxy. And it's got to be 6 years ago. Now, how do you do epoxy or resin threads? Actually, it's kind of easy. And we learned a couple of tricks at the class. But this is the device that's prepared. He was so enthused. This is a little piece that's prepared to have epoxy poured to make threads. Now, we found out that in general, if you're going to use 16 threads per inch, you want to cut a groove about 100 thousandths wide and then fill it with epoxy. If you mix your epoxy, don't put a lot of bubbles in it. You don't need to put it in a pressure pot. Just pour it in there. That's what I did with that one. Let it cure, make your mating piece. And in the case, the other thing we learned is if you make them both 110 and make them the same diameter, if you make your grooves the same diameter, both 110 wide, that gives you enough material to do both the ID and the OD threads and have it thread together. And this is about a little over 1/8 of an inch deep. When you get to the point, you get a little better. I know. Nice little device. Thank you, Walt. Fine threads, nice turn, very decorative. Works out very, very well. I think I'll hold on to these because we're going to talk about these a little later. Let's talk about tips for how you make good threads. You want to practice. If you're going to get woods that hold threads, you're going to be into a little bit more money. So practice on something you don't care about first. And the easiest way to practice is to practice on plastic pipe. That's why we've got this set up here. And by the way, when we get done, we're going to invite you to come up and cut threads on plastic and get the feel for it. Okay?
Women will do better because they have rhythm. Men don't have any rhythm. Cutting threads involves an awful lot of rhythm.
It does. When you cut threads, it works well to add a little wax. Now, how do you get the wax under the threads? You got to save your old toothbrushes. That's the easiest way. Start to cut the threads, then take your toothbrush with a little bit of wax on it, put it in, go back and finish off the cutting of the threads.
Wax just acts as a lubricant. And when you're going over the plastic or a piece of wood, it helps your tool. It goes along a lot easier. So think of it as a lubricant. You're doing the same thing as you would put WD-40 on a piece of something.
Furniture wax.
Yeah, Johnson's wax or Brie wax or any of those type of things work good. You just keep it there with your toothbrush and go over it real easy. You got to ask yourself, first of all, what you're working with, and then how are you going to start working with that piece? There's some really critical things that happen right at the beginning of when you're doing threads that you have to keep in mind. Of course, you have it on your lathe and all, but I just happen to have a piece of wood here that we're going to thread. So it should be pretty easy. You can envision this is what goes in your chuck, and you've got the piece you're starting out. How do you get this square? Now with a piece of pipe, that's already done for you, so you don't have to worry about it. Well, there's a couple different ways you could do. You could get a Forstner bit, right? That would go from here to here, drill it in, but then you end up with that little hole from the point. Well, there's a couple ways you can do that too. You can just take and make a little piece that would fit in the bottom of that and cover it all up and turn that. Or you could do it a different way and just get a scraper and go along the side. But there's some really important steps along the way. You start out with something that looks like this. You're going to chuck that up in the lathe, and then you want to turn threads in there. So that's what this is. Well, I just happen to have a yellow pencil. Yellow pencil is one of the best tools that you'll see when you're turning threads, because when you go in and you lay this on the side of your cut, you can tell whether it's square by looking at the waves on your lathe. If the pencil's a little bit off like so, you have to take a little bit more off of this end. If it's the other way, you have to take a little bit on this. But it's imperative before you start that you have that yellow pencil parallel to the waves. Then the next thing you would do is you would take a tool and you're going to round this off. And we're going to show you this in a minute. You want to round this. That looks like not a very important step, but it is a very important step, because when you're starting, I just happen to have my tool, and I didn't pay $100 for it either. It's pretty special. But as you start cutting your threads rather, you don't start like this. You start with like the second or third tooth on your tool, and you start with a rhythm. You're going like this. And then you cut with picking up like the second or third tool until you get a notch in there, your first tooth. And it looks like this. So now your tool is on that notch here, and you still keep it going. And then you lay it down a little bit, and then you work back into here. Now, what happens if you keep this tool and it hits this back? Anybody know? You're stripping every thread off. So it's really important that you keep an idea where your tools are. So as you're going down here, you'll pull it out here. This one has a little notch here that some people will put in when they're turning threads so that it gives them space between the back and the end. Well, what you want to do is get the tool out of the way before it hits here. So you go that far and you lift it out. But what works out cleaner is if when you're working with this, is as you come down here, and this is what Spence will show you in February about your tool and what Bruce has referred to. As you get down and you're starting to get to that point, you now rock your tool up. And you see that it follows the threads down. Well, what happens when it gets to the bottom now? It doesn't strip anything out except this piece down in here if it does that. So if you miss, that's what happens. And if you look at that tool, can you see that? That this portion here is what you grind away. Because if I have a tool like this, it hits there, I can't get it up out of the way enough. But if I grind that little black piece off and tilt it up, now I can get it into that point and I don't strip those threads out. So this is just a blow up of of how you go about the process. And we're going to go ahead and do that now. So
that's one of the things that's different between, I don't want to say an amateur, but a more experienced person that does threads. You don't need to put that relief groove in either side, because as you're finishing off, you only have one tooth engaged in doing any cutting. And when it gets down to the end and it stops, it takes one tooth worth of clearance and automatically machines it. Now, this latest little leaded box coming around, you can see where there was a relief groove cut, so that when you did the threading, you knew you were getting there and it was time to lift and to come out.
this is was a brand new Carter tool that I took up to Craft Supply with me. And I thought this was great. I've got this new tool. It works wonderful. And the first thing happens with it is the instructor, Kirk DeHer, who is another one that's going to do an IRD for us next year, takes this new tool and puts it over on the grinder and he starts doing this to it. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what are you doing to my tool? But after explaining it and using it, became very clear why and how you do that. And also they sharpen, like he said, they sharpen this edge. So whatever tool you use, make sure that it's got relief when it gets to the bottom of your thing and you won't have any problem stripping threads.
On the external threads, the reason that you carve a piece away here is because when you're doing external threads, you need a way to get over so that only that last tooth is engaged in cutting. So when you come up against the shoulder, it'll hit that shoulder. It'll wipe out that last tooth width, but that's all. If you relieve it fully straight, come this way, you'd wipe out all the threads when you hit the shoulder. But if you can get it over, you only take one tooth worth. And that makes your threads look a lot better and done by a more professional individual. When you do threading, you want to run about 250 to 300 RPM. Now, in some cases, people will say, but I don't have a tack. How on earth do I know how fast I'm running? Well, in that case, you got to worry about adjusting belts. When you have a lathe and it's running, if you look at the threads with an eye and you try to follow just one thread, magically, when that occurs, you're down around 300, 350 RPM max is when you can follow one thread as it moves on the lathe. Now, there are times, and I was guilty of this, I kept thinking, well, wait a minute, that's a little fast for me to get the rhythm. I'll go a little slower. You're more prone to what's called drunken threads. Drunken threads go like this when you go around the perimeter of your. So you want to stay in that 250 to 300 range so that your threads more likely to be consistent and straight. So, and one of the things that Rick talked to you about that was important for us to learn is the importance of that being a radius when you want to cut threads, not a chamfer. And that makes all the difference in the world. Because if you have a chamfer, you're just trying to catch two different points of that chamfer, and it doesn't make it quite so easy.
When you're catching the radius, you can see you're only going to have one point there. If it were a chamfer, you could see where you would have two teeth on it. And when you go to start cutting threads, you ought to try both. You'll notice right away why you put a radius on it.
Probably top down now, assuming this thing doesn't jump back at me. Remember, never move the tool rest while the lathe is running. I'm about 45 degrees to where the tube is. And like Rick said, I need to get a rhythm. I need to practice. And this way, tool rest has a little nick in it. And then you go in, and now I can feel I got a thread started. Once that thread starts.
Actually, when he's doing that also, you'll feel that the piece will pull the tool along as it follows the threads. So it's really imperative that you get those first couple threads started correctly. And as you can see now, he's starting to rock that tool around that radius and go down the side. And ultimately, he'll keep it straight to the side.
And now my thread profile curves like this. So I've got good threads out here, but I'm not straight on the threads yet. And if I were to use the magical patented device, and I put my pencil on the top of my threads, see the direction the threads take? So I've got to get those threads to the point where that pencil will sit more like that.
He still doesn't want to bring it all the way flush on the side like that Because one of the things you do when you've cut your internal threads first, and when he has that on an angle like that, he can bring it in and it should meet somewhere in the middle of your threads so that you then can get it sized correctly.
Yeah, not good, is it?
Well, this is a demo, always happens in a demo.
I think we found an easier way to do this now.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. What I mean by what I was saying, this is straight. That's what you want for your internal piece, is to have that straight. Now, when you're doing your threads, your external threads, what you really want to have is your threads on your piece to come a little bit on an angle like that. Because when you do that, you're going to find out where that meets, what radius on that piece meets with your internal threads. And then you can then start working your threads back from there. And if there's too much of this sticking out, you can just cut it off. But at least if it's tapered, your male piece is tapered, when it goes into the female side, it'll meet somewhere along those threads, and that's your starting point. That makes sense? Any questions?
Now I've got straight threads. When you're threading, most people think it's a lot easier if you establish the female threads first and then make the male match the female. That just seems to be a lot easier way to go about doing. When you finish off threads, you think you're just about where you want to be, but maybe the fit isn't quite right. So you got just a little bit more work to do on the threading. You don't have to do that with the lathe on, and it works very well, particularly on the inside threads. Just take your threading tool and follow in the groove, and it will scrape and get rid of more material on the threads until you get the fit you want, so that it fits on very nicely. Okay, so don't be afraid to work it by hand. The other thing is, when you do a threaded lidded box, I got one left. Ideally, you ought to have two flat surfaces where the top and the bottom meet. Now the question is why? If you don't, and you rely on only the threads to line it up, your top is going to sit a little canted because it's following the thread rather than locking up on a flat surface. The other thing you want to do, think about how many threads you want. And the reason is this one, 1, 2, 3 threads. Is that the motion you want to go through every time you want to get in the box? Now, they did a study back in around World War II about the ideal number of threads to have. And they did it relative to toothpaste tops. And 1.5 threads was about right. It gave you a way to lock in. It felt secure, but you didn't get bored sitting there trying to get the cap off. We've talked about the art of grain match, and it's a lot easier if you've got a setup like this where the two flat surfaces meet and you're trying to make the grain match. You can just take a little bit off of one, let it thread a little farther down, and as it works its way around, when you're done, it'll match. Rick's talked about as a safety, when you pick up a box, don't pull, always turn and twist in case it is threaded. That is the end of the things that I had to cover.
I think that's about
Now,
it.
what we want to do is we want to invite you to come up. We'll turn the cameras off so it doesn't go out to Zoom land. And we have 2 lathes set up so that you can try and see about getting the feel to do some threading. Any questions? John?
You send them the tool with it and they can do it by hand.
Yeah.
That's tough.
And it's, how do you determine the tolerance if you make the box here and send it back east? Yeah, definitely you want to make the threads loose. You probably want to stay with 16 threads per inch, not 20. I'm reluctant to say seal it with CA. Maybe that'll help it. But the other thing is, if you thread something that's green, you're doomed. It's not going to work. You need to have very good dried wood if you're going to do threading. Ergo, yeah, if you do the resin, you're safe. If you do ebony for both internal and external threads, would be a very good match. Anything other than that, bit of a gamble. Oh yeah, lignum vitae would be excellent. Lignum vitae, I don't know how many of you had a chance to work with it. It's a very oily wood, very dense, and it threads like butter. It is wonderful. Yes, yes. Craft Supply.
You can get pieces.
But to me, resin solves a lot of the issues. Make it out of whatever wood you want, put 110 thousandths wide groove in it, thread it, and you're home free. Any other questions?
Does everybody understand what he's talking about, that groove, 110?
Okay.
You could use the board out there too.
Remember this, we sent the mating piece around. The width from ID to OD is 110 thousandths wide, or 16 threads per inch. If you're going to do 20 and you want to, I don't know whether it be conservative or not waste as much or whatever, you only need to have 70 thousandths for the width of that groove to fill with resin or epoxy, because it's a finer, smaller thread. Does that help?
Dean,
Yes, Dean. Same diameter. You want one on the top and one on the bottom. You got to do this twice. This is the mating piece to the other one that's going around. Yes. Resin or epoxy. Yes. Oh, you turn the wood away. Take the wood away on the inside of the top. Well, not necessarily. Yeah, it depends on which way you want to do it.
you have your piece, then you have your groove inside here. This is your 110. Then you would take this away. That becomes your internal piece.
Drill it out.
Take it out. However you get it out of there, you can drill it, put a scraper. The other way, the same thing, it would be you're taking away this part. Now you have the outside or the male threads on the outside of it. In other words, there's two pieces that are there.
Correct.
You mean in this area in here? That could be a drill bit and then a small scraper. Well,
no, that little tiny box that went around, haven't seen that one yet. That one is small, but the top is small and it was still big enough that you could get the threading tool in there. Yeah, right. Stand on the dot. Here we go. Now I know how Ken feels. Yes. And I am that way a lot of times. But this is the result, right? Here's the top. Took away the inside, made the threads a little towards the outside of what we had for the epoxy ring. All right. So you're left with about half of it left that you took away. Then you took the bottom, hollowed it out. Now you're on the outside. Take about half of it away, put threads in that until they match. You're pouring epoxy into that groove and letting it sit up. It's in the raw piece of wood because you got to have something to hold the epoxy in place. Jerry was busting Spence's chops about how many threads. Spence says, yeah, but when you turn threads, you want lots of threads so people know you know how to turn them. Questions? Ready to come try it? Rebecca has one over there. Oh, sorry. 110 thousandths. Call it 1/8 of an inch.
So basically you're at 55 on each part. How do you know when you've gone? How do you tell when you're starting at 110, when you're down to 55, so you don't end up with 45 in a gap or 65 and 60?
You don't.
That'll make it interesting.
What you do is you turn part of it away. Let's say you're working in the top. So you're going inside. You turn about half of it away and thread it. You're done. Now you turn a diameter on the bottom just so it fits. You start to thread the OD and you try it. Does it fit? No. Thread down a little more. Does it fit? No. Thread down a little more until it goes on and it threads in. Yeah, you can. And that's what I used to try to do. But when we were in a class, that was one of the things that I learned from Kurt. Don't screw with it. 1/8 of an inch is enough. You can get both ID and OD threads. Just keep them the same. You won't run out. If you try to offset it, then sometimes I got a nice internal thread. I don't have enough left on the inside because I moved it down too far. I can't get back to fill up the hole to make it a nice threaded bit. What else? Ready to try it? You got a lot of people who've never threaded before. Here's your chance to learn.
Thank you, Bruce and Rick.